Hey folks, what's going on? It's Pastor Hassan, and it is Friday morning devotional time. It was pointed out to me that on the last update video, I made a mistake with the day. I got the correct date, July 15th, but I kept saying Tuesday, July 15th, when in fact July 15th was a Wednesday. But thankfully, everybody was on point with that and showed up to the Bible study or prayer meeting at the appropriate time. And yeah, thanks for keeping me on my toes. But this is Friday morning's devotional, July 17th. And so this morning, ahead of the sermon that we're going to be looking at, Lord willing, on Sunday, we're going to be dealing more with this topic of idolatry. And we're going to be dealing from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 14 to 22. But just ahead of that, we want to look at a text that I will reference on Sunday from Deuteronomy 32 that just gives us a little glimpse into the history of the people of Israel. Paul has kind of been dealing with that in the beginning section of chapter 10, and so it's kind of appropriate for us to continue thinking about the example of Israel and how Paul makes applications from their experience to us. And so let me just read from Deuteronomy 13, beginning at Deuteronomy 32, beginning at verse 10, and we'll read to verse 18. I'll make a few comments. All right. This is what God's word says in Deuteronomy 32, beginning at verse 10. It says, "He found him in a desert land, and in the howling waste of the wilderness, he encircled him, he cared for him, he kept him as the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions, the Lord alone guided him. No foreign god was with him. He made him ride on the high places of the land, and he ate the produce of the field. And he suckled him with honey out of the rock and oil out of the flinty rock, curds from the herd and milk from the flock, with fat of lambs, rams of Bashan, and goats, with the very finest of the wheat. And you drank foaming wine made from the blood of the grapes. But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him, and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. You were unmindful of the rock that bore you, and you forgot the God who gave you birth." And so this is a song of Moses, and this song is really one that's written in as a witness against the people of Israel. They've experienced this profound amount of grace from God, and they've been surrounded by his goodness, and they've now been given sort of their expectations as his people and as they are about to enter into the promised land. So you have in general these blessings for obedience and this promise of cursing for disobedience. That was the terms of God's covenant with the people of Israel. And in the same way that Moses lays all that out before the people of Israel and calls heaven and earth as a witness against them, he composes this song as another witness, as an added layer of, okay, you know what you're getting into, and you know what's going to happen if you don't live up to this covenant agreement, this calling that you have from God. And so he sort of recounts something of Israel's history, and he does it in really poetic terms. And so he speaks of God finding Israel in a desert land and encircling them God is pictured like an eagle, like a bird, surrounding his people with his wings. This is a picture of his protection and care. And it says in verse 12, the Lord alone guided him, and no foreign god was with him. And so this is like right from the early portions of this song, Moses is reminding the people of Israel, like, God alone is the one who saved you. Your affection and your loyalty belong to him exclusively. There is no other God who is responsible for your salvation, your protection, and your care. He's reminding them of that very clearly. And so he just goes on in these verses and recounts the way that the Lord cared for the people of Israel. He provided honey out of the rock, oil out of a flinty rock. This is probably a reference to God's provision of water from the rock in a couple of occasions in Israel's history. But you also know the imagery of a land flowing with milk and honey. This is a picture of sustenance and God's, again, supplying and providing for his people. But notice what the people of Israel do. Even you have this picture of they've been given the very finest of wheat. You drank foaming wine made from the blood of grapes. So God's lavish provision for his people. But here's what the people of Israel do in response. But Jeshurun, that's a sort of a I don't know if playful is the right word, but it's a reference to the people of Israel, grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleek. So they got comfortable. Life was good. God was taking care of them, and they started, feeling themselves pretty good. Like they're enjoying what they're taking part in, and which in and of itself is not a bad thing. But where it went bad is what we see next, as they grew fat and comfortable and just sort of enjoying all of this lavish provision. It says, then he forsook God who made him and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. And this is not the only occasion where you see these sorts of warnings. Like, this is what actually happened in reality. But the people of Israel were warned repeatedly, like, listen, like, don't be oblivious to the fact that once life gets going pretty well for you, like, it's a very real temptation for you to forget God, to forget the very reason why you're enjoying all of these blessings. And that's exactly what happened. And so they forgot. Look at the irony of this. They forsook God who made him. And so you have this almost like creation language here. In the same way that God made the heavens and the earth, it's like God made Israel as a people. Like they were not a people, and God made them into his covenant people. And yet they forsook him. They turned their back on him. They scoffed at the rock of his salvation. It's almost like they treated God as a joke. And listen to verse 16. It says they stirred him to jealousy. And how did they do that? With strange gods. With abominations, they provoked him to anger. So remember, you had this statement in the beginning of this exclusive loyalty that the people of Israel should have designated for God and God alone. And yet, instead of doing that, they forget about the God who saved them, and they stir him to jealousy. And that picture gives us a good sense of biblical jealousy. When God is spoken of as a jealous God, he's rightfully jealous, in the same way that a man who has made, or a wife who's made in a covenant relationship is right to be jealous for the affections and the love of someone, of their spouse. And so if your spouse is stepping out on you, like it'd be weird if you didn't have a problem with that. It's right for you to feel an anger and to feel like, hey, like that love that you're giving to somebody down the street or whatever, like that belongs to me. You promised that to me, and this relationship is exclusive to us together. And so in the same way, in an even more profound way, whenever God's people step out on him, when they give to other so-called gods affection and attention and worship that he alone deserves, he is rightly and righteously jealous. So unlike human jealousy, which is even in the best situations is shot through with sin because we're sinners, God's jealousy is purely righteous. And the people of Israel provoked God to jealousy by chasing after other gods, after idols. And notice this, with abominations they provoked him to anger. God does not take idolatry lightly at all. But notice this language in verse 17. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods that they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. So don't miss this connection. In talking about idolatry, we'll see in the text that we'll look at on Sunday. Make no mistake about it. There is a very real power behind idols. Idols themselves. Paul will talk about idol sacrifices having no real existence, but there is very much a power behind these things. And Moses here identifies the power behind these idols as demonic. They're demons. So when these sacrifices were being made to idols, they were being made to demons that were no gods at all. And so the Bible is clear right from the earliest stages of addressing the whole issue of idolatry that part of the danger, aside from it robbing God of glory that he rightly deserves, part of the danger of idolatry is that it's at its core demonic. And the trouble for us at times is like we don't often deal with instances of idolatry that are overtly demonic. They seem in a lot of cases relatively harmless, but like at their core, idols and all forms of idolatry are demonic. And so it's important for us, brothers and sisters, to remember, as Christians, we too owe our exclusive loyalty to the God who saved us. And so we need to examine our hearts regularly to see if there are things in our hearts that are dragging us away from the Lord, things in our hearts that we are reserving affection for, that things other than the Lord. And so it can be sometimes hard at times to examine our hearts in that way. And sometimes it might be good to have other people who know us well, other believers, so to check in and maybe ask questions and or maybe, depending on the nature of the relationship, they can pinpoint some stuff in our lives. But it's important for us to be aware of our own tendency towards idolatry, and to make ultimate things out of things that are not meant to be ultimate, to worship as God things other than the Lord who saved us. And so, just be meditating on those things and thinking about the nature of idolatry, and we'll see what Paul has to say to the Corinthians and in terms of how they should address the whole issue. And then, we'll see what we can take away from it as well, Lord willing, and help us from that. May the Lord help us to live lives that give exclusive devotion to him alone. All right, love y'all, and we'll talk later. Okay, God bless.